Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today we have a super extra triple quadruple special guest, and his name is Tim Townsend. And it's kind of funny how this all came together is I posted something on my LinkedIn, or it's actually the people that work for me posted it, and it was like a short video, and it was about some solar modules that were from Arco Solar, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then I was corrected. Somebody corrected me, and his name is Tim Townsend. And then we also figured out that a long time ago, in 2007, I took Tim's class at the Pacific Energy Center in Stockton, California, when he was teaching classes for PG&E, which was pretty cool. And I got to go find my notes and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's a long time ago. So welcome to the show, Tim. Thanks for talking to me. It's an honor to have you here.
Oh, I'm flattered that you asked me to come on, Sean. Thank you.
Yeah, and then another thing that was kind of cool too is we just started talking, and we were talking about the Eclipse, and I didn't want to lose that. And that was before the show. It was just like the first couple of words. And so here it is.
Sean, hi. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too. I guess we did meet a long time ago. You were teaching me some things.
Well, supposedly, like I said, apologies that it was so long ago that neither of us seem to remember.
I know I was going through a lot at that time. That's when I turned 40. I quit drinking, changed my life around. You got an Eclipse shirt on. I saw you were also in Oregon. I was just kind of Googling you, and I saw some YouTube or something like that.
Oh, yeah. I've posted, I think, 2 YouTube videos in my entire life. And one of them was like a 9 or 10-minute thing of the eclipse from up near John Day, Oregon with my dog.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I was at my cousin was living up in Salem, and it was kind of funny. Her and her ex-husband had a CBD farm.
Uh-huh.
It was just surreal. Like, I don't know, like 20 acres of pot plants and 100 people camping out, and then the sun disappears, darn it.
Well, oh, so it disappeared at the moment of truth?
Yeah, I mean, the sun disappeared. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, where I was, I don't know, let's say 100 miles from there, 75 miles from there, a little bit. It must have been east, definitely east of Salem. And in that forest up in John Day, it was clear. And I even went up on the ridge so we could see the Umbra approaching from the west and then watch it retreating afterwards. So, I mean, you saw the video, so you saw where the vantage point was. It was
I
fortunate.
didn't have time to see the video. I just saw that it was out there. Yeah.
Oh, it's just fascinating. There's science and there's science and there's more science. But what we did for this second eclipse in April of this year, it was also on my wife's birthday, but the first eclipse passed through Carbondale, Illinois, where I went to school. And I just didn't think it was worth the long drive at the time, just in case it was going to be cloudy. And then this most recent one crisscrossed at kind of like a 90-degree angle coming up from Mexico. And so the only place on Earth where there was 2 successive eclipses where you could have been in the dead center line of both was in Makanda, Illinois, about 4 miles from Carbondale. And the senior year when I was in Carbondale, I lived on a farm in Makanda about a mile from this magic crossing spot, and I was studying solar energy. Now, if I'd been studying it better, I probably would have been smart enough to buy that farm and, I don't know, sit on my butt for 40 years and sell T-shirts and camping spots like your friend did in Oregon, and work 2 days of my life sitting on a lawn chair selling T-shirts and camping spots and been able to retire comfortably. So I messed that up.
Yeah. Well, my cousin wasn't selling tickets. She moved up there from California. So, we were all just camping out, just her buddies and stuff like that. It was kind of like a party the night before. We were all playing guitars and stuff like that. But I also got to see the last one too. I went to Dayton for that.
Dayton, Ohio?
Yeah, I went to Dayton, Ohio, and I met my newly born grandson there too, which was really cool.
Oh, and it was actually, I think, well, you tell me, but I think it ended up being clear. I mean, it was touch and go, but was it clear? No, yeah.
The Oregon one was like more clear though, and I did notice a difference. But it was still, I mean, it was really, both times it was amazing. It's like people that have never done it, they'll never know. They don't know what they're missing.
This was a conversation in our house too, because at the time I was having trouble convincing my wife to take the drive up to Oregon with me. And so she watched it from the parking lot here in Davis, where it was like 70% or whatever, with, a bunch of other people with the glasses on. They're like, yeah, that was okay. I mean, it certainly didn't get blackout, and not even close. And if you didn't have the special glasses on, you'd of course never have any idea that you were in an eclipse.
Yeah, yeah.
But you go up to Oregon and we had the full 2 minute and whatever 5 second blackout, and I came back gushing about it, and I showed her my little YouTube video, and she saw probably how over enthusiastic and happy I was about that. And it was kind of funny having the dog there with me as my science project to see what his reaction would be. But we went to my college town as kind of like a quirk or a reunion or whatever, not a reunion. What do you call homecoming? And like I said, it was on my wife's birthday. So now I had to twist her arm saying, she's like, I'm not going to go all the way to Illinois for my birthday to watch clouds. And I was like, oh boy. So like I said, it was cross your fingers, touch and go. And it ended up being a spectacularly beautiful day. So as far as we know, we are the only people on Earth who stood at the exact spot, or I should say sat at the exact spot where the previous and current eclipse crossed. And it turns out it was a spot a couple 100 feet out in this reservoir, this lake in Makanda, Illinois. And up until the day before, I had mistakenly thought from the Google Earth paths that the crossing point was in this open field about maybe a few 100 yards away. And then we bumped into some people the day before that were scouting it out. And they're like, no, the map was updated. The crossing point is out in the water at this place called Cedar Lake. And I'm like, oh, no. And, we didn't have a boat. And I was like, well, we got to go steal somebody's boat or build one. And she's like, well, can't we go buy a raft at Walmart? And so anyway, so we got up at like 6 o'clock in the morning and went to Walmart about 5 miles away. And we bought the SS Walmart and a few 100 feet of climbing rope. I tied it off on a tree on the shoreline, and we sort of paddled out to this, what we thought was the spot. And the only people we had to share it with, I guess, were maybe some fish, but so I should post that video too, because it's about a 4-minute video of us experiencing the full blackout from the wilds of Cedar Lake, Illinois and Makanda. That was fun.
Awesome. Yeah. I remember I went and saw a ring of fire eclipse, the one when the moon's farther away. It was up near Shasta. Remember, I rode my motorcycle up there, and when I saw it, it was nothing compared to the real thing. And it was 99% blocked or whatever that was.
Now, was that in October of 2023?
No, this was probably somewhere around like 2011 or something around there.
Because there was one just this past October, and I took the dog with me to go see that one, the annular eclipse. And we viewed it from a vantage point alongside a road about 10 miles north of Winnemucca, Nevada. We got up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and drove to Winnemucca. And there was a lot of people parked along the road, up and down here and there. I mean, you don't have to be in the dead center line to experience it, but plus or minus 15 miles, everybody had the same opportunity for a good view of the annular eclipse. But we were, again, I was pushing the limits of silliness and just went right to the exact spot. And there was half a dozen other people there. And we got some fantastic pictures from that event also.
Awesome. So how did the science experiment work out with your dog?
Well, he wore his doggles because he had those yuppie dog goggles when they want to lean their head out the car and keep them from getting their eyeballs scratched.
You didn't take a motorcycle with a sidecar up there, did you?
No. It's been quite a few years since I had a motorcycle. I never had a sidecar, but my sidekick was happy to go up there and do the eclipse viewing with me. But my gosh, you know how dogs are. After about 5 or 10 minutes, I mean, he's bored. He pretty much snoozed through the whole thing unless I was kind of prodding him for a reaction. But I was there with my pyranometer and my solmetric, and I was doing sun measurements that I captured on the video. And so I don't think he was too interested in the science.
Yeah, I remember for that Oregon one, I was in the process of getting a pilot's license. And my goal was like, I got to get it before the eclipse. And so that was my first trip that I took, is I went up to Oregon and I landed at Salem and all that. On my way back, I was getting fuel and I was talking to the guy that was filling me up. And I was like, yeah, did you see the eclipse? He's like, oh, yeah, I saw 99%, thinking that was 99% is good. And it's like, no, that's 1% is good.
Yeah, it's about 0.1% is interesting. Yeah, you got to be under the center line. Well, if we're still around another 20 or so years from now, 24 years from now, there's going to be one that passes right over Highway 5 up around Red Bluff, Redding.
Oh, cool. So, that's where I saw that annular one right up in that way.
Yeah, I might be in a wheelchair by then, but hopefully I'll be in a wheelchair, but yeah.
That way it's easier to lean back and look up.
True. Yeah.
And then there's one that's coming up. I think the next one that's like a good place on Earth, if you want to go out of the country, I think Spain looked like a good spot to
Yeah, it
watch
looked
it.
like a little nip of Spain. It's kind of cruised through like Iceland and some other places, but yeah, I think it's going to nip a little corner of Spain as well.
Yeah, and that Iceland weather, probably not too good of a chance for that.
Yeah, you have to go there for other attractions, which I've never
Yeah.
been to Iceland. I've never been to Spain. So all of it would be cool to me.
Yeah, that would be kind of cool to watch it from an Iceland hot pool if it was one of those 1 out of 365 clear days up there.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Blue Lagoon. I went there once.
Oh,
So,
lucky.
yeah. So, do you have any questions or anything?
Well, I could talk to you all day about your experience with the Eclipse and from the CBD farm and the fact that you're a pilot. My older brother's a pilot. He's only a year older than me. And it was kind of funny because he actually soloed before he got his driver's license. And so when we were in high school in Illinois, he worked at an airport. And so we would occasionally rent like a Beechcraft 4-seater.
Uh,
And so we used to go up in the little private plane for an hour and fly around and just go, ooh, ah, look at Lake Michigan or look at this or look at that. But I never really followed through on that the way he did with his sort of love for aviation. But I do have a pilot in the family.
well, that sounded pretty cool how you were like watching, you said the umbra, the shadow of the
Yeah.
eclipse.
Yeah. Coming in at 2,000 miles or 1,000 miles an hour.
Wow, that's pretty cool. I guess the shadow doesn't make a sonic boom.
Nope.
Just kidding.
If it would have, it probably would have woke up my dog Leo. He would have been, what the hell's going on?
Yeah, I guess they say that something like a shadow can travel faster than the speed of light.
Well,
Not that
yeah, and when
particular
you
one.
do the solar geometry, it certainly does move. The shadow moves, but on the other hand, it doesn't really make a sound of its own, and it's not pushing air the way an airplane would when it breaks the sound barrier.
Yeah, we can fool some people though.
Yeah.
And so maybe I could have seen that when I was with the plane up there. I was thinking maybe I should try to get up in the air to watch this thing, you know.
Well, and you
But
probably saw some of those things when people who were specifically taking chartered and commercial flights
yeah.
that
Mhm.
were in and on the path, and then they would kind of like go and strategically sit on the right side or the left side to get the best view of the eclipse and have a photographic opportunity of seeing the black spot on the ground and so on. And some of the people were a little disappointed, and the airlines kind of misled people or they bungled it up a little bit. But the 2017 one, I think people pulled it off a lot, at least from my recollection. There's a lot more positive stories out there on the internet and photos of people who observed the eclipse from an airplane.
Uh-huh.
And then the most recent one, partly because a lot of people were banking on the skies in Texas and that area as being statistically more likely to be clear. There was a lot of commercial activity and buzz about doing it from there, but the weather was horrible there. And so people were making these great escapes in their rent-a-cars and whatnot and trying to fly to like Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, drive as fast as they could out of Texas and then have to hustle back and return their rent-a-car. So we talked to some people that had gone through that sort of story. And some of the people were like, well, we flew into San Antonio or whatever, and then it was bad weather, forecast for bad weather. They had just enough days. They're like, that's it, we're going. And so they made it to Arkansas, which prior to that, they didn't even know Arkansas was on the map. And so now they came back with a t-shirt from Arkansas where the weather was clear and they got to see the eclipse. And they were exhausted from doing 1,000 miles of driving there and back, but they got the t-shirt.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I remember when I saw that one in Dayton recently this year, and I was ready to go on a 100-mile drive or whatever it took, And fortunately, we actually started going to see where it was more clear because there's like some haze and stuff. And we ended up going out and then turning around and coming back a little bit just to get rid of a little bit of haze. But it was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I also wanted to ask you, Tim, about the solar from the Carrizo Plains, because you seem to be a super expert on that. And you said that you have one? Is it like one of the modules?
I do have one of the remaining Carrizo modules. Yes.
Wow. And so I guess what you were saying on that LinkedIn chat, or it was like something that I posted and all these cool people were also posting back, like Mark Morose and Joe
Yep.
McCabe and stuff like that. And I'm looking at it right now, and you have like the front and the back side of the Arco Solar laminate. And so what a laminate means is there's no frames on it. So it's a frameless module that you have. And so this Arco Solar array, that was like in the 80s. Do you know? I don't want to say anything because you'll just correct me anyway.
Well, I don't remember the exact dates. And in fact, I wasn't even working in solar energy when that project was coming about. I was working at PG&E.
Uh-huh.
And I was working in a group that dealt with contracts for small power producers. Although the stuff that I was usually assigned back at the time was more like enhanced oil field recovery and geothermal and such. But I always liked solar energy, wanted to be in solar energy. It's just that it was a small group of people. But the contract and the construction, I think, started around 83. And then by 84, it was starting to operate. And then they had one of these special, at the time, the state had ordered or sanctioned, I guess depends on your point of view, a few different standard offer contracts for the utilities to comply with the 1978 Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act legislation. And so they hired a cadre of people to be buying contracts, setting up contracts with small power producers. And they wanted standard offers. There was a standard offer 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't even think standard offer 3 ever happened, but standard offers 1 and 2 were shorter term as delivered things. Standard offer 4 was the prize. And Arco Solar is a long-term contract, or at least a semi-long-term contract with a 5-year fixed price period that at the time was pretty attractive, like 9 cents a kilowatt hour, $90 a megawatt hour. So they started that project on the strength of this 5-year cushy, by then standards, a long-term contract. So they made 9 cents a kilowatt hour from 84 through 89. And that was, I think, part of the impetus for Arco Solar to invest their own money and develop this project at this superb site up in Carrizo Plains.
Uh-huh. So, I mean, to me, 9 cents a kilowatt hour for solar back in the 80s doesn't sound cost effective.
Oh,
But
no, it
yeah,
probably cost Arco Solar 40 or 50 cents a kilowatt hour to
yeah, or a
make it.
dollar or two or something maybe.
Yeah, something off the charts. Mark,
Especially if it's only going for 5 years. Yeah.
yeah, well, yeah. But, we used to talk about this, the chicken and the egg thing about, the solar industry would say, well, we would make more of them and make them less expensively if you people would just buy them. And the response was, well, we would buy more of them if you would just make them cheaper. And so
Uh-huh.
it's like, well, who is going to blink? And,
Yeah.
I think
Uh-huh.
it's widely understood that the entire country of Germany blinked. 2004-ish, I think Germany said, okay, fine. We will overpay for solar in order to help trigger an industry growth. And it worked really well.
Yeah.
But yeah, years earlier, 20 years before that, there was this foray into it from the Chatsworth, California company, Arco. And so they decided to put some of their own money behind it. And they actually put in a system, a 1 megawatt system, the world's first 1 megawatt system, went in 1982 in Southern Cal Edison territory, maybe 100 miles or so from Carrizo Plains, at a Lugo substation at a place called Hesperia. And so it never got as much attention. But there's promo flyers. I got some old literature on it. But the Hesperia plant was also like Carrizo, a 2-axis tracker, and it didn't use laminates. It used real framed modules of that vintage that Arco was making. So Hesperia went in 82, a 1 megawatt, and then 2 years later, Carrizo Plains started up. It was ultimately like 6.5 megawatts, also on 2-axis trackers.
Wow. Okay. A little bit of geography on that too. It's kind of somewhere in the middle of California is where you're talking about, like inland from San Luis Obispo, sort of like
Perfect
that.
description. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's probably 75 miles or so, twisty miles inland, directly east of San Luis.
And then I think that same old site, or at least close by there, SunPower put up some kind of big old 500 plus megawatt project that might even have been the biggest in the world for a short period of time.
I think that sprawling area where SunPower put in, I'm forgetting the name of that project. It's got kind of a generic, like American Solar. I can't remember exactly what it's
Uh,
called, or California Solar. It's some sort of forgettable name.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I think it's like 250 megawatts or maybe larger. And that sprawling area is on multiple parcels that are just a mile or two, I would say, south and east of the original Carrizo site. And there are others that are
Uh,
there now also. In fact, I think even that original Carrizo site might be populated with solar now.
Uh-huh. Yeah, for some reason I know I heard on the internet, which is super reliable when you hear something on the internet, that there's solar in the exact same spot or something like that. And so maybe we could talk about a little bit more about Arco. So that's the actual oil company,
Yeah,
Arco, and they
Atlantic
were
Richfield. Yeah.
making solar modules. And there's also some lineage that goes way back, and this company gets bought by that company. And I think it went through like Arco and Shell and ended up at Solar World and then SunPower, which is now Maxion. So like that lineage in a way, like if we had a family tree, it would still exist.
Yeah, and it even
Yeah.
predates Arco Solar. I think it might have been Spectrolab or Hughes or somebody like that
Uh-huh.
had the original work on that material. And then Motorola, maybe, I can't remember, but it was Arco Solar for several years. And then the first shift in corporate ownership was to Siemens. So in about maybe 1990, I think that Arco sold it off to Siemens approximately. And then Siemens had it for, I don't remember how many years. I don't know if it was quite 10 years, but maybe a little bit less than that, 10 years, close to it. And they sold it to Shell. And then Shell had it for, I don't know, Shell game
Huh.
had it for 2 or 3 years. And then it became Solar World California, which was actually a German company called Solar World California. And then I think that that changed and became Solar World, and they moved the plant up to Oregon near Portland. And then that was kind of what I view as the sort of corporate end of the road. But I think you're right. I think eventually, when that plant in Oregon was shuttered, I think that the SunPower derivative snapped up some of the people, assets, technology, and so on.
Yeah, I think with Solar World too, they had it divided up. So Solar World in Germany went under, whatever they call bankruptcy in Europe. And then Solar World Americas didn't go under. And then somehow SunPower bottom up, I guess. That's what I heard.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So I was wondering too, like that project that was something like 6.5 megawatts in the Carrizo Plains, do you think that was most of the solar in the world there?
A good chunk of it. I mean, it was certainly almost all of the grid connected portion.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the quirks about the development of our industry is that it developed at its own sort of healthy pace, serving the off grid market for quite a few years before anything popped in the on grid market. And I'm trying to remember, when I was working on my master's work in Wisconsin, that was from 87 till 89. I think one little bit of the research I was doing is that I can't remember now if the worldwide production was 25 megawatts per year by that 87, 88 timeframe, or whether it was the cumulative was 25. But for some reason, 25 megawatts sticks in my head is the sort of mid to late 80s. And so if Arco was 6 megawatts, I mean, it was certainly a big sizable chunk of that. And by the next year, 85, there was a 1 megawatt Arco system that went in at Sacramento at Rancho Seco. And then within the next year, there was another 1 megawatt installation right next door to it, or at the same parcel as Rancho Seco. So, within a couple of years of there were other examples of 1 megawatt systems, whether it was Hesperia or whether it was the two that adjoining each other in Rancho Seco at Sacramento, or whether it was the 6 megawatt system at Carrizo. Those were the ones that stand out in my mind as the early landmark big grid connected systems. But yeah, sort of undertold or lesser told in that story is that the off-grid market was probably in a healthy fashion supplying, I don't know, 10 times that amount of solar in bits and pieces to people that were living off-grid.
Wow, I didn't realize the off-grid market was that big at that time. That's a lot of people.
There was a surprising transition, Sean, that the cumulative world sales or world installations of off-grid was not passed by on-grid until about, I don't know, like 2000 and let's say 2005. It was certainly after the year 2000. So like California had instituted its net metering program in 1998, and then other states sort of trickled in afterwards. And we had our rebate program started in 1998 also. And it didn't do much until 2000, 2001, when they upped the rebate from $3 a watt to 450. And then it triggered, a couple 100,000 installations in California. And then, like I said, other states, New Jersey and some others followed, shortly thereafter within a couple of years. But the real transition, even with all the explosion of installations that were going on overseas in Germany, and it wasn't just Germany, but it was principally Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and so on. It took a few years for the on-grid market to catch up and pass the 15 years or whatever it was head start that the off-grid market had in terms of total installations. It was a surprisingly recent transition date. And, now nobody even remembers or cares how much solar is sold off-grid because it is, a drop in the bucket compared to the on-grid.
Mm-hmm.
But the transition was a little bit later than maybe some of us might imagine.
So I'm familiar with people saying that people like David Katz and John Schaefer. So David Katz started AEE Solar, John Schaefer started Real Goods. And depending on who you talk to, one of them or the other one sold the first ever solar module that anybody ever bought, like the public, or it was available to the public and it was sold to the hippies and all that kind of stuff up in Humboldt County or Mendocino County or something like that. And so also I hear that they were recycled from that Carrizo Solar project that was the 6.5 megawatts. So maybe that's not the case.
There was both of those. I mean,
Huh?
when the Carrizo Solar plant was bought up by the New Mexico vultures, the contract was up. And so they were only going to be getting like 2 cents a kilowatt hour to sell electricity from a highly degraded plant. So
Wow.
they dismantled it. They dismantled the Hesperia plant and they started selling off the bits and pieces on the open market. And so for quite a few years, the Carrizo modules that were sold in like 3 different grades of quad lambs. There was a Carrizo Gold that was the highest quality, least degraded ones. And there's, I don't remember, Carrizo Bronze or Carrizo Copper or something like that. But there was a few grades of those post-Carrizo modules that were sold in places like Real Goods and AE and so on. So yes, they were on the for sale market.
That's kind of funny. You're saying like Carrizo Gold and they're selling it to a bunch of potheads up there. Sounds like that was some marketing there. Carrizo Gold, dude. I got some for you.
Yeah, there was some timely marketing there. But, as far as like solar modules that were available, I mean, not that it was a lot, but even back in like 1972, 73 timeframe, the first grid connected system, and this is grid connected, was in Newark, Delaware, a University of Delaware, probably a combined DuPont project, was 1973. It was on a experimental home in Delaware. So that actually predates a lot of this other stuff. It didn't get a lot of attention and it degraded quickly and it didn't run very long. But in terms of grid connected, we could go back all the way to like the 70s. And I remember when I was fascinated, a lot of kids wanted, BB guns or whatever for Christmas when they're younger. I wanted a Radio Shack 17-in-1 or whatever it was science kit because it had a solar panel, like a 2-inch by 2-inch square solar cell that, you could illuminate that with a light bulb or whatever, and it would make things make noise or fans spin or whatever. So to me, the fascination with solar started when I was like 11, 12 years old or whatever, and got this cool Christmas present where solar cells were being packaged in science kits, even back then in the early 70s. Some of it predates the solar hippie stuff, but I think that for commercial purposes, it's a funny and probably largely accurate story to say that the off-grid solar market in Northern California was an enormous commercial boost to solar.
So you were saying 1973 for the grid tie. So for some reason, I've heard that I thought that Ward Bauer at Sandia Labs came up with the grid tie inverter in 77. So that's...
I've known Ward since the late 80s, and I didn't know that his earlier career included making an inverter. I just never knew that.
He's not much of a show off.
No, he's funny too, but
yeah.
Modest and funny. But there's a guy that is still, I think, on the faculty at University of Delaware, Stephen Hegedus, and he was the author of a McGraw-Hill handbook on photovoltaic science and engineering for its first and second editions. And on the second edition, he had asked my firm to help out with a chapter on systems for the second edition. So I contributed one chapter to that book. And Stephen is in Newark, Delaware. And I think he had also the first residential grid connected home in the state of Delaware. And that didn't come in till later, but he was in some respects associated with that 1970s effort as well.
Okay. And so did I get it wrong? Did I say New Jersey when it's supposed to be Delaware? Or 1973, or is that a different place?
Well, you're partly right, because Newark, the one we know of, is in New Jersey, but there's a smaller Newark, Delaware. And so Stephen and
Delaware. Oh,
yeah,
getting a little bit mixed up. You also mentioned quad lam, and I've heard of that. Is that like 4 times laminated or something like that?
Yeah, because the modules themselves, they're only like 1 foot by 4 foot. And so the laminates were easier to pull off of the rails, I think, pre-assembled as groups of 4s.
Oh, okay.
Mechanically and electrically linked as groups of 4.
So there'd be like 4 modules that are already fastened together.
Yeah.
Okay, that's...
And they had been pretty severely degraded. And so from a commercial standpoint, selling them one by one, I can't remember what the power was down to, but it was nominally probably half of what their original nominal rating was. So what might have originally started out life as a 40-ish watt module was probably in the 20 to 25 watt range by the time they were resold on the secondary market.
Huh. And that also makes me think of, how like they say the difference between a solar module and a solar panel is you take multiple solar modules and you make a solar panel, but everybody calls a solar module a solar panel. So we just go along with it, calling them solar panels.
I
But
think
maybe
so.
that's where it came from. What they would sell them that are four already put together as a panel.
It could be. And the other thing is that where it entered the sort of vocabulary, to me anyway, is that, a good 10 years before that, it was solar hot water heating. And they tended to be sold in panels. They were branded. They never called them modules, that's for sure. The 1970s solar hot water heating stuff was always referred to as panels. And mostly because they were kind of built on a substrate that started life as a 4x8 sheet of plywood. And so the area of a 1970s, early 80s era solar hot water heating panel, whether it was, vacuum tube collector or just a flat plate darkened with glass, those sort of physical looking predecessors to today's photovoltaic panels, I think they were actually probably normally referred to as panels. So it could have just been a carryover of the lexicon from solar hot water heating that sort of interchangeably found its way into the photovoltaic vocabulary.
Cool. So I bought these Arco Solar modules about, I don't know, if I had to guess, like 8 years ago or something, off of some guy in San Francisco that bought them a long time ago when grid tied first came out. And he put them on his roof and they had to work with batteries. And he gave me all of his old gear and stuff like that. And he was trying to sell them on eBay or Craigslist or something like that. And he couldn't get anything. I think I bought him like 12 of them for $200. And I was like, oh, these are just like collector's items. And it's been worth it. I've been, giving a couple of presents out and people are super stoked. And I think it's worth a lot more than what I paid for it just for putting it on your wall behind your head when you're on a Zoom call or something.
Yeah, I'm going to have to tell that because the way I came across those browned old Carrizo modules was a football coach here in Davis had a getaway cabin out in Point Reyes that was on an expiring 50-year lease. And they had gotten into the habit of carrying a couple charged batteries out on their truck every time they went and lived in the cabin for the weekend. And then
keep you strong.
Yeah. Well, he was football coach, so he didn't have any trouble lifting the batteries. But, this is going back almost 30 years ago now, maybe not quite that much. But he had asked my wife and I to help him come check out his cabin. And he had gotten through, I can't remember, some other friend of his, a bundle of these Carrizo Solar modules. So I took the IV curve tracer out to the Point Reyes and we tested all the modules and binned them and started assembling them for this guy Dave's cabin. So the modules that I came across had a second life of about another 15 years on this cabin out at Point Reyes. And then when that leasehold expired, they lost all their assets there to the feds. And they had all these, now I'll call them junk modules. And so they asked me if I wanted any of these Carrizo Solar modules. So I got a couple of three of those. And I had given a couple of those away to my colleagues. And one of them, I think, was like a white elephant gift at a Christmas party. So people were fighting over it. Like whoever got it, might or might not have wanted it. I can't remember. But then somebody else craved it. And so this odd looking old brown module became this surprisingly desirable white elephant gift. And so there's a woman that lives up in Truckee now, Erica, who I'm going to have to remind her that she's sitting on a priceless gem. I think she thinks it's pretty priceless anyway, because she's mentioned that a few times, that how much she cherishes having this old bit of photovoltaic history. But yeah, they're floating around. There's a few of them out there.
So the ones that I got from this guy, and it also came with like an Arco charge controller and an Arco inverter, which I thought was kind of cool. And the modules themselves are framed. They seem to be in pretty good shape. They have that
Look like it.
Yeah, they have that nice browning and stuff like that. And so the one thing I was going to ask you too is they have frames on them, but it also says Carrizo on there, and they have this round plastic thing on the back, like a round plastic junction box.
My suspicion when I saw that on your post was that those labels might have been applied by what I call the vulture, the Carrizo vultures, the New Mexico investment firm that scooped up, and scavenged the Arco assets. they started rebranding and reselling those things, probably within 6 months of buying the plant out. I mean, it took them a while to carefully disassemble and palletize and get a marketing plan for those things. So I think that they had their own sort of like silver mylar labels that they just affixed to the back of the old Arco stuff.
So you know what I'm going to start doing? I'm going to make some Carrizo labels and just stick it on every solar module I come across, some nice shiny
Hey,
looking bifacial half cell 700-watt module.
Sean, we've now entered the post-truth world. I don't know what's stopping you.
Got to do it. Okay, thanks.
Don't tell anybody I said it was
Okay,
okay.
yeah. I promise not to tell anyone. I'll just let you do it.
Don't tell your mom. Don't tell anybody that you ever respected. But yeah.
Yeah, and I also remember too, like the first time that I came into contact with PV really was my dad had an off-grid place up in the mountains, and it was just like we would read Home Power magazine, and it was the 90s and the Solar Living Source book from Real Goods and stuff like that. And he got all his stuff from Real Goods. And so those ones were a little different from the ones that I have. They were 33 cells, which is kind of weird.
Yeah. And well, the choice of using 36 was really born out of, I don't want to say convenience, maybe necessity is a better word. But if you want to charge a lead acid 12-volt battery, it needs to get to 14.4 volts to fully charge it. I mean, depending on the age and the temperature and all that. But a fully charged 12-volt battery is really like a 14-ish volt battery.
While it's charging like your car driving down the road or whatever.
Yeah. So if you leave a little voltage headroom for voltage drop between the origin point and the delivery point, you want to have a maximum power point on the modules that's maybe in the neighborhood of 16 volts. So that, if you have a line that's 50 feet long or whatever leading to your battery, you might have a voltage drop depending on the length and the wire size. And again, the temperature. And so you want to have the ability to fully charge a lead acid 12-volt battery at all times. I mean, if that's the design criteria, that kind of was. And so 36 cells that have nominally an operating voltage of about a half a volt apiece will give you an operating voltage in the neighborhood of 18-ish. And so that was found to be a convenient and sturdy and trustworthy amount of cells to put in series to assure that you would always charge a 12-volt battery. And plus, it made a nice package fit in terms of the symmetry of, you could have a 9x4 shape in the rectangle. There were also modules that were sold a little bit later that were 35 cells that were called self-regulating.
Yeah, I see those out on the water sometimes.
Yeah, and so the 35 in series, all that really meant is that it operated at a half volt less, and it was less likely to like overcharge a battery.
Yeah.
And the original ones were 33, and it was with, I think, the same intent, is that it would be used to charge a 12-volt battery. It just didn't do it very well, especially on hot days.
So that was made for self-regulating, the 33?
Yeah, extremely self-regulating. Like that was probably an experiment in showing how you can charge a 12-volt battery up to 11 volts reliably. I think the 33-volt ones were not an absolute failure, but they weren't reliable enough in terms of giving you a sturdy and reliable, full hot season charge on a 12-volt battery. So I think that's probably what was the trigger for making modules with more cells in series.
So the 33 cell modules, was it just kind of a mistake when they invented it?
I guess that's a polite way of saying it.
Because it's not a nice round number, like I guess you got 11 times 3.
Hey, they were Lewis and Clark. Was it a mistake to try and get across the Rocky Mountains with boats and then, running into, Lolo Pass, Montana, and then going, well, I guess we can get to the ocean from here. I mean, yeah. But maybe we'll just turn around, or maybe we won't. I mean, I don't know.
They were like a million or a billion years too late when it used to be the ocean over there.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, so the 33 cell footprint, was tried out, and then they probably had a lot of marketing and science discussions and finger pointing, and they're like, you know what, we got to go to 36.
Cool. All right.
Yeah.
We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's Solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show. So what was the class that you were teaching that I took back in '07?
Well, there was a variety of ones, but I think the one that you took was called system sizing and site analysis, which was, I think, the second in a sequence, because PG&E had offered originally a thing called a basics of photovoltaics class. And so this is going back, to around 2005, 2006. There was a gentleman that worked for PG&E. I think his name was Darren Bouton. I never met him, Bouton. And he had prepared a slide deck on solar. And I can't remember what the reasons were, but PG&E had contacted my company and said, well, this guy's either being reassigned or has something else to do. Would you guys be interested in tackling these presentations? And prior to that, I had been doing it I kind of cut my teeth out at the PVUSA project in Davis.
Great. Awesome.
And that project was running more or less from 89 until 2000. And so we used to do training sessions, presentations, and so on there. And so we kind of inherited this slide deck that was originally, the core of it was created by PG&E. And it was, like I said, I think they had this 2 classes is what they wanted to divide it into. So I think the one that you took was the intermediate class.
Great. Yeah. Those were the good old days.
I really enjoyed doing that. I mean, I probably taught that class, I don't know, maybe not 20 times in Stockton, but, probably at least a dozen times in Stockton. But they had me teach it as far north as Arcata. We did it a few times, Santa Rosa, Petaluma, Auburn, PG&E classes as far south as Bakersfield, up and down the Highway 99 corridor, Sacramento, of course. There was quite a few of them. And then because they had still some association and obligation with Southern Cal Edison, Edison had us do the same basic presentations. I'd kind of relabeled the logo for having it be SCE specific instead of for PG&E, but the content was roughly the same. So I probably did 5 or 6 more of those classes for Southern Cal Edison in places that were down near, what's the place where that sriracha hot sauce is made?
Is it Tulare? Is that what you're thinking of?
Tulare, they did it several times at the Tulare Ag Training Center, yes. And then some other ones were down there in that Burbank, Pasadena area, wherever that town is where they make sriracha sauce. I know that's where, where SCE has a training center, and everybody was there not for the solar. They wanted to go get samples of sriracha sauce.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of funny. I'm doing some SCE solar classes right now.
Oh,
about 12 a year.
Where do you teach them at?
It's all online. I guess since COVID, everything seems to be going online.
Okay.
So, yeah. So I guess I'm carrying on your tradition.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that the torch was passed successfully.
Thanks for cutting the way for a lot of people. You've been in this industry for so long. It's pretty awesome. When did you first start doing solar?
Well, if you count that Christmas present that my parents were kind enough to get me, instead of, like I said, my older brother, other people always wanted motorcycles and BB guns, and I got the science kit. So I guess you could say it started there.
I hope they didn't hit your science kit with the BBs.
I wish I still had that science kit. Now, I've even looked on eBay. You mentioned that a few minutes ago. You could still buy those Radio Shack, like, whatever it was, 17-in-1 or kits. They had various levels of how complex they were. But yeah, that was the start in the 70s. But when I was at Southern Illinois in the 70s, 80s, I had solar design classes there. And then I always wanted to get into it. But when I started working for the utility, there wasn't really anything happening in solar. And so I worked in some other stuff for a few years. And then I went to the University of Wisconsin to study solar. And when I finished that master's work up in 89, this solar project that PG&E had actually started, I heard rumblings of it in the hallways when I was working at San Francisco. And the rumblings were for this national cooperative project that became known as PVUSA. And so when I was finishing up in Madison, Wisconsin, the PVUSA project had found a site in Davis, 86-acre site that used to be on a former landfill. And they had started the construction. And so I started there in the spring of 89. And so that was really where my, professional photovoltaic career started, was here in Davis, where I still live, in April of 89.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So yeah, I keep hearing PVUSA coming up when I'm teaching these NABCEP associate classes, and it seems to be that people want to know about PVUSA test conditions.
Oh, yeah.
Did you invent that?
I did not invent it. That, I think, was a carryover from the steering committee and technical review committee that was the architects of PVUSA. And one of the people who was the architects of that and was on the one or maybe both of those committees was another John Schaefer, not the one you're thinking of from Real Goods,
Uh-huh.
But the real John Schaefer, I think my friend John Schaefer used to work for Electric Power Research Institute. And so EPRI was one of the participating people on the technical review committee, steering committee of PVUSA on this. It was mostly funded by Department of Energy, but it had participation from what was the precursor to NREL, which was called SERI, Solar Energy Research Institute, Jet Propulsion Labs, Sandia Labs, EPRI, a bunch of different utilities, PG&E, and then several others. We had utilities from Hawaii, Virginia, Colorado, New York, and so on. And so this consortium, they decided that they would put the headquarters for these side-by-side careful tests of emerging technology. They would put the headquarters in at a site in Davis, but they always had ambitions, and it played out, to have satellite locations. And so we had satellite systems that were either identical to the Davis ones or scaled down and otherwise identical, but scaled down in places like Austin, Texas, and Kihei, Hawaii, and Sacramento, Kerman, California, Denver. There was maybe a couple places in New York, Farmingdale, New York, Maspeth, New York. There was a lot of them. And so this was pre-internet. And so we would have dial-up service where our data logger would be on a loop and registering what was happening at the 15 or so systems that we had side by side in Davis. But then once a day, we would download the data from these other satellite locations, and then we would analyze and compile and report on that to an audience of 6 people. But, it was really good work because it was carefully done science at a time when a lot of people didn't want to spend the money to put solar in the first place. And they certainly didn't want to spend the extra money to outfit it with good instrumentation and professionals that were there watching it and babysitting it and reporting on it. So that was really what the core of what PVUSA was all about.
Yeah, I remember flying around near Davis and spotting it. Like it's on the map and going like, hey, there's PVUSA. And compared to these big solar farms, it's tiny, but it's got such a reputation, since it's been around for so long. So did you say it started in 89?
Yeah, the first system to start up was actually an Arco, a 20 kilowatt system, started in early 89. And it was using framed modules that were of that 1 foot by 4 foot footprint, 36 cells. They were called M660s. They were the most efficient modules in the world at the time. They were a little bit over 14% standard test conditions. So anyway, getting back to your point about who invented PVUSA test conditions, like I said, it was mostly an outgrowth of recommendations from the National Steering Committee people from, again, the precursor to NREL, but Electric Power Research, John Schaefer and others. They're like, well, the standard test conditions are 25 degrees C, which is fine for a spring day, and 1,000 watts per square meter, which is representative of a nice summer day. And the combination of conditions that standard test conditions represent are essentially almost never seen in the field. And so the power outputs that people would talk about on a nameplate label are never really seen in practice. And so PVUSA test conditions was an attempt to try and retain some of that nomenclature, like the 1,000 watts per square meter is actually achievable maybe, 9 or 10% of the hours of the year near midday. And it can be exceeded, of course, but that actually is doable near noon on a clear day in nice locations for enough of the year that they retained the 1,000. Nice round number.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of fixing it at a 25-degree cell temperature, under those conditions, you tend to have cell temperatures that are more like 45. And so they said, well, let's use an air temperature instead of a module temperature as the reference. And we're going to reference PVUSA test conditions as 1,000 watts per square meter sunlight intensity at a 20 degrees C air temperature, not a module temperature. And then they used a carryover of a 1 meter per second wind speed, because that was a carryover from the sort of Sandia and JPL block testing that was trying to analyze the thermal performance of modules. And when they came up with a term that they called NOCT, and the nominal operating cell temperature, NOCT, is a bit of a carryover from that, late 70s work also, because on one hand, it's an anomaly because it says nominal operating cell temperature, but it was never done under operating conditions. It was open circuited. And the 1 meter per second was a wind speed that was characterized as the wind speed in a direction that's not predominantly parallel to the array. 1 meter per second is like 2 miles an hour. It's very, very, very mild. So the PVUSA test conditions themselves brought in 1 meter per second wind speed, 20 degrees C air temperature, and the 1,000 watts per square meter. So that's where it became popularized as a PVUSA test condition. And that was used as the basis for paying for and procuring these things. The bottom line is that a rating under PVUSA test conditions tends to be, 10, 12% less than the standard test condition rating.
So you said that NOCT was done at VOC?
It was, yeah. The NOCT test was just done on an open rack at about, 4 or 5 feet above the ground. And the modules were never hooked up to anything. They were just open circuited.
So that would mean, VOC means it's turned off, open circuit voltage.
Yeah.
And almost all the time now on a PV module data sheet, they give you the NOCT, but then they give it to you at a power.
Yeah, that's
And I
funny.
think I've seen it at nominal module operating temperature also in MOT.
Yeah, you see some variations in that. So NOCT was really a temperature. The outcome of an NOCT test, the answer is not a power output. The answer of an NOCT test is a temperature. And it tended to be in the sort of 44, 45 degrees C range. So if you then want to rate a module at 1,000 watts per square meter sunlight intensity and let's say 44, 45 degree cell temperature, then that gives you a power output that is nominally 10 or 12% less than if you had done it under standard test conditions.
So one thing too that just people listening should know is about thermodynamics, you have to account for energy. So if you're taking energy out of a module when it's not at open circuit and you're sending it to somewhere else, your working module is cooler than your open circuited module.
Yeah, probably these days, the more efficient the panel is, the cooler it gets. So it can be 3 or 4 degrees cooler than it would be at open circuit for sure.
Mm-hmm. So that's what makes it a little bit confusing about NOCT if it's an open circuit test, but then they give you power on there that they just like take that temperature and run some numbers.
Yeah, the other thing I failed to mention is that NOCT, the origins of it is they wanted to find what operating conditions, when they say nominal, are representative of the midpoint of where 50% of the energy per year is made above or below this level.
So that's also 800 watts per
So
square
that's
meter.
where
Yeah.
the 800 came from, is they did modeling at about, I don't know, 25 or 30 cities. And if you drew like a cumulative distribution curve, it isn't entirely true because it's so different. It's moderately different depending whether you're in Albuquerque or Seattle, of course. But if you look at a sort of blended overlay of all these cumulative distribution curves of the amount of power that is generated at or above a certain radiation intensity, 800 was kind of the nice round number that they all nodded their chins and said, okay, we're going to call this the balance point. And so the NOCT test was constructed around the belief that 50% of the energy that a solar panel makes per year is at or above or below this balance point of 800.
Great. Awesome. And so some other things that they've used for the same conditions for PVUSA, which is like NOCT, but it's at 1,000 watts per square meter.
Correct.
PVUSA, then you have PTC, that's performance test conditions.
Well, it used to be called PVUSA test conditions, and then other people have sort of hijacked the nomenclature and just called it performance test conditions.
Oh, so it's exactly the same calculation.
Like I said, people have taken liberties with it. What we were coming up with and branding in the 80s as PVUSA test conditions was the abbreviation was PTC. And then later people decided, PVUSA test conditions, there's nothing magically great about those either. I mean, they're much more likely to occur than standard test conditions, that's for sure. But there's nothing sort of hard and magical. Performance test conditions, I think, is an adaptation, to put it politely, of a term that originally meant something else and then was hijacked to convey something else. And the differences are pretty small.
Yep. And then the other one that they have too, besides PVUSA, PTC, is the California Energy Commission CEC test conditions.
Yeah, and that one was a little bit of a sore point because when PVUSA was still going on, one of the partners in it was the California Energy Commission. And in fact, they managed the project during some of the waning years of its existence. And some of the people at the Energy Commission wanted to, for the purposes of the California rebate program that was starting up in 1998, they wanted the rebates to be paid not on a basis of installed standard test condition watts that you purchased, but this contorted lower number.
Yeah, a lot of people were calling it the AC rating, which there's nothing AC about it.
All they did is they multiplied a nominal inverter efficiency by this reduced nameplate DC efficiency. There was nothing realistic about it in terms of accounting for incidence angle losses or voltage drop or shading or soiling or any of those things, or even the real efficiency of the inverter. It was just the branded nameplate label efficiency of the inverter under its best conditions. multiplied by this PVUSA test condition thing, which was a desktop creation that more or less was about 10% less than standard test conditions. All they did was rescale the numbers, and it just confused people. And it's had a legacy now that's gone on for way too long. But I don't think it ever improved anything from an administrative or a practical standpoint. But it seemed as though around some table, it seemed very necessary to do, and it was done.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So there was the CEC for the PV module, and then the CEC for the inverter, I guess. And is anybody using that anymore? Do you know?
There's probably some legacy people who refer to it, but for all practical purposes, it was never necessary, in my opinion, to begin with. The reason that people abided by it was because in the earlier years, going back 25, 27 years now, California was the game for PV. And if you wanted to play in California and sell something in California and get an incentive in California, you had to play by California's rules. And those rules meant, among other things, that you had to define the system and the size and the quantity of the rebate according to their scaling of how they wanted to regard the capacity. And that was just how the Energy Commission wanted to regard the quantity of capacity as being somewhat diminished relative to what the manufacturers would say is the STC DC nameplate for the product. To give them some credit, they were trying to make it a more consumer normalized, realistic looking AC actual output thing, but it was never predicated on any actual measurements. So for example, if a module manufacturer was going to sell you a 100-watt module as a nameplate STC DC, it would be branded as, let's say, a 90-watt module for the purposes of the CEC, essentially because it was thought to be running in the field at a higher temperature. But there was nothing in there that actually conditioned the measurements to be realistic. So, for example, a 100-watt module manufacturer, back then, they would typically brand and bracket their thing. They say it's a 100-watt module plus or minus 10%. And no human being on Earth ever got a 101-watt module out of a 100-watt bin. But a lot of people got 90s and 91s. And so this routine shortchanging and deliberate shortchanging of the customer was the norm in the solar industry. And so if you bought a 100-watt module, you got a 91 or a 92 or a 93. I mean, it was very rare to actually get a 100-watt module. And if you ever got 101 or 102, they quickly put out a new product called the G-Wiz 110. And then they would surround that with a plus or minus 10% thing. So everybody was always routinely getting shortchanged on the binning from the flash test ratings were always less than the module nameplate rating. And the manufacturers, tried to bury that under the rug for a long time. And the Energy Commission was mildly upset by that. And I was in some meetings where the manufacturers would sort of defend the practice, and they didn't call it cheating or lying or deceiving. They called it positioning. They called it market positioning. And so they were all just looking over each other's shoulders to see, well, if Shell or, Sanyo or, whoever was the bigger manufacturers, the name brand manufacturers at the time, if they're selling a 100-watt module and the bin average is 92, well, then the other people would follow suit. And so it became a bit of follow the leader. And it was all, like I said, sort of euphemistically branded as positioning. But from a consumer standpoint, it was theft.
And I think nobody does that anymore. Or maybe I've seen one company, like one data sheet that was in all the PV data sheets these days, it's like -0 tolerance. What do you think is the reason that they got rid of it?
Well, the first company that said we're not going to do that to people, as I remember, was a now defunct company out of Massachusetts called Evergreen Solar. And they started this
I have some of those.
Asymmetrical, yeah, those are good. Ribbon silicon. They started this asymmetrical binning where they said, we're going to sell you, let's say, a 100-watt module with a nameplate tolerance of like -2 to +3 or -3 to +2 or whatever. It was some asymmetrical and shrunken thing, but they were essentially narrowing the bin and saying that we're not going to rip you off by any more than 2%. So that sort of slowly started this guilt trip into other companies. But the other advantage of that, though, Sean, was that when you had really broad bins of, say, plus or minus 10%, and you hook these modules up in series, the non-alikeness or the mismatch that accrues when you put them into functional circuits was you'd have a couple percent loss in mismatch. So when you start looking down the cascading tree of where do you lose energy from the point that you take a module out of the box and then you connect it to the utility grid, you lose some of it due to dust, you lose some of it due to shading, incidence angles, the lower power response of the modules, the ohmic losses in the DC wiring, and so on and so on, the conversion losses in the inverter. There's, 15 different loss mechanisms that steal power from you, to the point where, not terribly long ago, and to some extent still today, the actual reliable energy that you get out of a module is 30% less on an annual basis than what the nameplate rating is. And so, maybe you could argue correctly that that reduction now is maybe more like 0.8. It's like a 20% reduction. But the biggest thing that happened that improved the industry's performance from a 70% knockdown on that loss tree, or a 30% knockdown to a 20, is the fact that they stopped routinely ripping people off by 5% on the delivered nameplate. So the bin average nameplate is now nominally considered to be zero. Like, you have just as much a chance of getting a positive as a negative. And since the bins are so much smaller, the mismatch losses have been reduced from anywhere from 2 to 5% down to a fraction of a percent. So the consumer has benefited two ways, both from the more honest dealing on purchase of the rating, and the fact that by binning modules that are more alike and then connecting them in series, you're getting rid of most of the mismatch losses that people formerly accrued. So that, and the inverters have gotten more efficient. And so the combination of inverters that are 3 or 4% more efficient than they were 20 years ago, the combination of better inverters and honest nameplate ratings and reduced mismatch, that has reduced the typical cradle to grave loss from box to grid from 30% loss down to more like a 20.
Cool. Yeah. And you also mentioned mismatch a couple of times. And so when you put modules in series, whatever has the least amount of current limits the flow.
Yeah, weakest link in the chain.
Yeah. And so that's another argument that people have for module level, maximum power point tracking, microinverters, and things like that.
It was a big impetus for it, absolutely, because people were squeezing, especially in residential settings. You see an awful lot of solar projects that are put in as big a footprint as possible on a smaller roof. In other words, there's a lot of corner shading from trees, shrubs, fireplaces, and so on. And if you're going by the weakest link in the chain and you got one corner of one module that's, chronically behind a fireplace, but it's connected with 15 or 20 others in a series string, you can cripple the output by, 80 or 90% compared to what it should. I mean, it was a horrible loss in some cases.
That was without the bypass diodes before the...
Even with the bypass diodes, you would still have these cripplingly large losses if you have chronic shading. And so, again, the snake oil salesman would try claiming that, we solved the shading problem. It's like, well, nobody solved the shading problem. But in terms of making things more shade tolerant, I guess if you were going to go into biology, they'd have like drought tolerant plants or whatever. If you were going to develop a shade tolerant architecture for solar, you would go with lower voltage, higher current, more parallel strings. And so the good thing and the bad thing is, like when Sunny Boy introduced the SMA string inverters into the US in around 2000, 2001 timeframe, we went from typically having anywhere from 12 to 48 volt DC systems to 400. And so the efficiency went up a lot. The amount of copper went down and all that. But the susceptibility to mismatch shading losses went up a lot. And so when you started having a residential market that was putting in Sunny Boy string inverters, where installers were putting in too many modules, you could actually have plenty of examples where if you would have put 10 modules on a roof, you could have gotten a great output. You put 12 modules on a roof and you don't go up by 12 over 10, the output would go down because, those one or two extra modules would often be hiding behind a fireplace or a tree, and they would drag down the entire group.
Yeah, a ton of stuff. And I think we're already up to like a record length, but that's okay with me. If it's okay with you. Another story that you mentioned before we talked, even something about a bullet.
Well, at that Arco system at PVUSA, it used to encourage it, is we would get, visitors from all around the world.
And so that PVUSA testing center out near Davis.
Yeah. And so we would give regularly. I mean, sometimes, every day in the summer, you get visitors from Australia, Japan, everywhere around the world. These people were cataloged and listed in our series of annual reports. I mean, it was hundreds, like 500 people a year or more would be visiting for a good decade. And so it reflected well on the American ingenuity, solar industry, and so on. It was a goodwill builder. It was fun. The problem we had is that PVUSA was built, like I said, on this city land that was formerly a wastewater sewage treatment area. And also on city owned land immediately south of it was an area that had a berm built that was used for a target range. And so the city of Davis would lease or let other jurisdictions, practice their firearms training out there.
Like the sheriff or something?
Yeah, and SWAT teams and whatnot. And so there was this one time, this is good, more than 30 years ago, the front sort of southwest corner where the Arco array was, in other words, the first place that your eyes go to when you're on a walking tour. I was giving a tour to about half a dozen people from Japan, and we had paused right there at that sort of front left corner of the array. And I was doing my dog and pony show, talking about the efficiency and trying to say it in Japanese and probably failing miserably at it. And, pointing and gesturing and so on. And they're taking pictures left and right and going, ooh, ah, because look at this technology. And they could see this whole field of other slightly different looking technologies of various thin films and concentrators and single crystal and polycrystal and so on. And as we were paused at this first corner of the first array, it was a hot day, clear day, windless day. And all of a sudden, this module shatters. And we were only standing 5 or 6 feet away from it. And we're like, wow, I go, well, I've never seen that happen before. And my first reaction was that it was because it was a little bit hot out. It was June. I thought maybe, well, it just popped, it shattered. But you could see a hole in it. And I was like, I thought, well, maybe a rock fell or something fell out of an airplane or a bird. But again, it was silent. It was creepy in how it just suddenly happened. And I continued doing the tour, but was like really spooked by what just transpired. And me and the other people, the tourists, were looking behind it, and it was just a bunch of gravel. So we didn't really notice the bullet initially and didn't fish around for it. But after they left, I went out there again and with the construction manager. And so the construction manager had found this deformed bullet that was right behind the back of the shattered module. So that started a whole series of different aggravations with, the PD and the city of Davis over who was going to be allowed to do this. And that would be a whole longer story for another podcast. But the bottom line of it is that that one incident triggered a whole series of changes where the city restricted the number of people that they were going to allow to do shooting. They said they would give us a 2-week advance notice of when they were going to be doing a shoot. They said they would erect a red flag at the top of a 30-foot pole to indicate that they were doing shooting. And they would come by our gate and let us know right before they were going to commence shooting. So the combination of restricting the use to just City of Davis people to train and practice and qualify their guns, and the announcements and notification, that was considered to be satisfactory for the project's insurance to keep us from being designated as operating in an ultra hazardous environment. Because when it first happened, there was a big insurance freak out. I mean, you think there'd be a personnel freak out that one of your engineers just almost got hit by a bullet. And I think somewhere along the line, people gave lip service to that. But since, me or the tourists didn't actually get hit by the bullet, it was a near miss. And so it became an insurance discussion, and whether or not they wanted to pay for the extra insurance to employ people in an ultra hazardous environment. The answer was no, we're not going to pay people and we're not going to pay insurance. And, who's going to want to work in an ultra hazardous work environment? So the workaround that was worked out was to make it a less hazardous environment through notification and restriction of use. And so we had this kind of awkward, we had to go take our computers and work elsewhere on the hours and days when the police department was going to be using the shooting range. So we had a bit of a land use tussle in the later years over land use of adjoining and incompatible land uses.
Crazy.
And I still have that module in my possession.
I was going to ask you that. You have the one with the bullet hole.
Right. Yeah. One year we gave it away or used it as a Christmas present for the In the Line of Fire award. Because at the time was that Clint Eastwood movie about, whatever, protecting the president or whatever, being in the line of fire. So that module still has this little badge on it called being in the line of fire award.
And you probably don't have the bullet, I guess. That's probably in some evidence bin somewhere or something like that.
Well, I don't have it, but I wonder if the old construction manager, Dan Shipman, lives up in Sutter Creek area. He might have it. I don't know. But
and you would think, too, that it's quite a coincidence that it happened when you were standing there. Did you have problems with the police department, or is it?
No. No, like I said, it was all innocent and silent, and
Uh-huh.
nobody, none of the tourists, it was just too incredulous to think that what clearly looked like a bullet hole could have possibly been a bullet hole. And we didn't hear the sounds of, like usually when you're near a target range, you can hear shotguns going off and they're loud. This was later deemed to be as a SWAT team. They were doing stress shooting. They were rolling over, like doing like barrel rolls and then like doing a stress shot at something. And, somebody shot one right over this big dirt berm and then it landed, a quarter mile away right in the
Oh,
panel.
probably got kicked off the SWAT team for that one.
I don't think so.
Stray bullets.
Their original reaction is that when the construction manager went over there, they said, okay, geez, yikes. And so then they came back about 15, 20 minutes later and they said, well, we didn't think it was us. And we're just coming here to tell you that it wasn't, because we just counted up and accounted for an inventory of all of the spent ammunition from our training exercise. And just wanted to let you know that we didn't think it was us, and it wasn't. And so then Dan had showed them the bullet casing, and he's like, oh, can I have that? No. He goes, that does look like one of ours. I was like, well, that's because it was. But,
Uh-huh.
I mean, that sort of answer is fine if you're, I don't know, maybe if you're a parent and you scold a child that's 4 years old and they don't want to fess up to something, but you expect a little bit differently, when it's that sort of thing. And like I said, it didn't initially go down in a professional way. And like I said, it triggered a whole lot of friction and animosity that it worked itself out amicably enough, but it did leave that legacy of the one broken module.
And so all that happened with like a whole bunch of solar modules, and you just happened to be standing right there. Was there other times where broken modules were noticed or any kind of
Oh,
sign
plenty.
of,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
from the shooting range?
Oh no, not from the shooting range.
Uh-huh.
No, but we had people that would like cut through the barbed wire and go and steal modules.
Because they were real expensive then, I guess.
Yeah, it didn't happen very often, but it happened. We had other ones that were broken for a variety of other mechanical reasons and others that failed for electrical reasons. So, but that was part of the test plan at PVUSA, was to see, well, what is the reliability of a solar module? And there was a government target at the time. There was targets for reliability, price, longevity, and so on. And the 1 per year per 10,000 was the sort of target reliability rate that was set up by the DOE road mapping of the time of the late 80s. And so that was actually demonstrated for a few of the arrays that we had. Not many, but the most durable arrays that we had certainly were able to achieve, and sometimes just barely, a failure rate of 1 per 10,000 per year. Now, as the industry has evolved and the panels have gotten cheaper, it sort of was softly accepted that 5 times worse, so 5 per 10,000 per year, was a more acceptable failure rate, and mostly because the panels have gotten so much less expensive. Today, if somebody was able to demonstrate a 5 modules per 10,000 per year failure rate, they would be getting awards from everybody that gives awards. I mean, I don't think anybody that's in the solar manufacturing business today would even attempt to get a failure rate of 5 per 10,000 per year, let alone 1. I mean, that's just almost laughably. Nobody, all the materials, the shortcuts and everything, they're just too inexpensive. And the fight for making solar panels cheaper amongst each other is so intense that nobody values reliability.
So that's really interesting. I was just talking to somebody before I was talking to you, doing a little bit of consulting, and they have this job to take an old solar system apart and put new modules in there. And the question was like, should they keep the same rack? And I'm like, yeah, it's like recycle it and all that kind of stuff. And so also maybe they should have kept the PV, especially if it's going to last longer, because the older modules don't have such a high failure rate because they were more expensive, I guess, as you were just saying.
It's a mixed, I don't know, Sean. It's a mixed bag, because on the other hand, the older modules started out as lower efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
and they may or may not have had a faster or slower degradation over time, because there's a mixed set of competing factors. One of the things that was very vexing about my time in the industry was that if you studied something long enough to characterize its degradation, so you're rewinding the clock ever so slightly. And this was, again, because at PVUSA, we were regulated by, federal types like Sandia, Jet Propulsion Labs, National Renewable Lab, and so on. The official story from DOE and everybody associated with them was that there is no such thing as photovoltaic degradation. There's no moving parts. It's a solid state device. There's nothing to corrode or degrade. Stop talking about it. But then at PVUSA, we were one of the first places that did careful and sustained measurements. And so in Colorado in 1994, I presented the 5-year results of about a dozen or more systems that we'd been running and showed a degradation rate that was like plus or minus, let's say 1%. Some were more, some might have been less, but they were all around 1%. And some were much worse. Thin films were much worse. And at the same conference in Lakewood, Colorado, a group from New Mexico State showed up independently with results that were consistent with ours for systems that were entirely different and for a comparable or even longer duration. And at the same conference, a group from Israel was there. David Feynman was presenting results that they had been doing of a comparable magnitude, comparable length of time. And so one of the outcomes of this 1994 NREL Performance and Reliability Workshop was this sort of like swallow hard recognition that they just got taken to school on the fact that this idea that there's no such thing as degradation is complete bunk. And people have been talking for years about the fact that EVA was degrading because even going back to your Carrizo example, it's visibly brown, it's making less power.
So that's the encapsulant.
Yeah. And so for a variety of mechanisms, they wanted to then, so Sandia got $1 million federal study, do an intrusive testing, core testing on what, if any, degradation mechanisms are happening from top to bottom on a cell. And so the idea that degradation is real really was something that was not brought into the public sphere until it became painfully obvious that it was. And ever since then, the sort of like pushback has been, as soon as you measure something long enough and accurately enough to characterize its decline, it either gets diminished on the argument that A, we don't make them that way anymore, we make them better. So you're always getting stiff-armed by the new manufacturers, the newest sort of like cheerleaders are all too willing to say, well, this is better, without any proof that it's better, but under the belief that they're being manufactured more automatically with better quality controls, that they're just better. They don't degrade as rapidly. And so people have kind of had to take it on faith that every time you attempt to try and characterize these things, your people will scoff at the results and dismiss the credibility of them on the basis that they're too stale. So there's that. And then there's the other thing that has really plagued our industry is that from a consumer standpoint, from an investor standpoint, all you really care about is results, not excuses. And if you're making an investment, you're taking it on the risk that if you buy a certain amount, you're going to get a certain amount of energy output. If then everybody is saying, well, the panels themselves intrinsically on a DC level on a one module at a time basis are occasionally, they'll take IV curves and say, oh, look, it's only degrading at 0.5% per year. But when you put them in a series string and you account for all the other factors and gremlins that come in, whether it's downtime or any other parasitic factors, the bottom line is that if an investor is seeing that their revenue is declining by 1% a year or more, from a practical standpoint, the effective degradation or the commercial degradation or the AC degradation, or use whatever label you're comfortable with, the true degradation from an investor standpoint is certainly going to be worse than 1% per year. Now, nobody wants to say this out loud when we're trying to promote PV because it sounds like you're being a hater. I'm just saying, if you want to be honest as a user and an investor, if it fell 1 or 2% short every year for a series of years, I don't know who I can complain to because nobody's going to honor that warranty. And the industry is very invested in basically telling people that your eyes are not seeing what your eyes are seeing, and that it's only degrading at 0.25% per year or 0.5% per year at worst. And so there's an awful lot of energy invested in sort of sweeping under the rug this widespread recognition and reality that the degradation rates tend to be far worse than what is being advertised. So,
wow. Okay.
It's not a positive pill to swallow, but I think it's an accurate pill to swallow. And so I think the industry would be better off just to sort of own up to that and sell a good product and just forecast it properly beforehand and work out the numbers accordingly.
Cool. I better go measure those Arcos I have and see what they're doing. The only problem is I don't know what they did when they were new.
Yeah.
So, those old Bell Lab advertisements for the 1954, they called it solar battery.
That's right. Yeah, the guy's standing next to a hole with about a 1 foot by 1 foot little module on it. Yes, yeah.
Have you ever seen one of those?
No, they probably exist somewhere, but I've never seen anything remotely approaching that old other than in pictures.
I'd love to see something like that. And probably what happened is just the stray bullets got them, you know. Another thing I was thinking too is just like, it's really strange that all those years that PVUSA was out there and the only time a bullet came at it by the shooting range is when you were standing there. Do you think somebody's got it out for you, maybe? Or just like somebody that still thought World War II hadn't ended because you were standing there with a bunch of Japanese people?
Could be, Sean, because after PVUSA went under, myself and another refugee from PVUSA were hired as in-house subcontractors at a BP solar factory in Fairfield, about a half an hour from here. And so I didn't do it all the time, but a lot of times I would ride my bicycle back, hour and a half, 2 hour bike ride from Fairfield back home. And there's an Amtrak train that you usually take, but there's a little town called Elmira that is about midway between Fairfield and Davis. And so on the Friday before 9/11, so this would have been September 7th, 2001, I was riding my bicycle home through Elmira, and a drunk guy was out in his yard, out of his trailer, shooting a .22 at a metal building across the street. And since I was riding silently by out of his field of view, or at least he was going a narrow field of view looking through his gun, and he was like, 50, 60 feet away to the side of me. I didn't see him standing there. And I just rode by, and all of a sudden I feel and hear this bullet whiz right by my Bell helmet. And my first reaction was to hear the sound, really, of the plinking. I think it hit the chain link fence, and then it hit solidly on this metal building. So this guy was just shooting bullets at a metal building, like an ag storage building across the street. But I knew that, I'd almost just been hit by this bullet, or what I thought was a bullet. And so I didn't have a cell phone at the time. I circled around, went to a payphone, called the police. They went out there. They found all these empty liquor bottles, beer cans littered all over the yard, multiple guns, drunk guy, no shirt. So I had to identify him in a lineup. And so when you said, is anybody out looking out for you? I think this guy was accidentally out to get me, but he almost pulled it off because
I think he was the SWAT guy that got fired for that stray bullet.
Actually, I don't know if he got fired, but he got deported. Let's just say that, because
Jeez, sorry to hear that. Wow.
We found out later that he had like 3 or 4 different social security numbers, and there was a court date, and he showed up in an orange suit, and there was a lot of stuff that went on. And then within a couple of days, that was when 9/11 happened. And so that sort of took over the landscape of the discussion. I mean, not that anybody else was aware of or cared that a guy riding his bicycle home almost got hit by a bullet, but certainly that became a lesser consideration than all the other things that overwhelmed, our brains, within a few days after that. But I just remember that as like, well, I almost had my own personal 9/11 a few days before 9/11.
Jeez. Wow. Sorry to hear that. And I think that you should wear a bulletproof vest. Yep.
Yeah.
It's probably a good idea for solar workers.
The only Kevlar I've ever had is on my bicycle tires. So,
Okay, great. All right. Well, I was thinking, like, it just seems like there's so much that we could talk about. Do you want to do this again?
Oh, if you ever want to, and you can stomach the conversation, Sean, it'd be fun. But I realize that this is sort of peripheral and silly discussion, but
no, that's what it's all about. That's, it's like we're getting the word out there. No, I think it's totally awesome if we can do this again.
Yeah. Well, beneath, the lightheartedness and all that, I mean, the serious part of what I think about solar, the direction of solar and the areas that I like to study, and I think I'd sent this to you in a little sort of teaser email or whatever, like the subject areas. I've been really working a lot lately on the net heating impact of solar. And it's, kind of bothersome to me that you're putting essentially a very dark surface that's converting very small fraction of that increased absorbed energy into electricity. And so it's not a no-brainer that simply putting solar panels in anywhere is going to be a net plus for the environment. And this is like, oh, you can't go there. You can't talk about that. But, I'm trying to study that. So I've been working on that. But the degradation thing and the other thing that's been a sort of like bully pulpit thing for me that you've probably seen on LinkedIn is that even though I've been in solar for 35 plus years and grid connected solar has been around for over 50, going back to that Delaware system, I personally have never seen even a 20-year string of numbers to characterize the annual output. Again, no excuses. It might be bad numbers, might be good numbers. Even the Egyptians would write on the walls and leave a record. And the solar industry has sort of skated along with like, well, we wear tie-dye on the weekends and we play rock guitar and we're kind of like cool hippie guys. But okay, fine, we can sort of coast on that cool guy reputation. But in the meantime, just show me 20 years of consecutive numbers. If the product is supposed to last for 25, 30, or 45 years, and people will say it so casually and confidently, it can't be that hard to dredge up a 20-year history when there's literally hundreds of thousands of systems that have been running that long. And as a way of reducing risk and building a sort of a sense of confidence for investors, I think that tracking down and characterizing the long-term performance of solar on nominally a minimum of 20-year basis is an absolutely necessary ingredient towards getting a stable and mature and trustworthy industry. So again, it's not news that people in the industry want to hear because we're trying to explode and build and put stuff in everywhere. And I just want people to sort of like, well, take a breather and let's just see exactly how we should be representing the long-term performance. So that's one of the areas that I personally like studying still and would like to see more attention paid to.
Well, maybe what we could do is schedule another time to do this, maybe in a month or two.
Yeah, sure.
And talk about all that kind of stuff. And even, we were talking a lot about history, so maybe we could talk about what you're up to and that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, anytime, Sean. I'd be flattered.
Oh, thanks so much.
Whenever you ask old people about what happened yesterday, they're always flattered. So I'm now in that category.
The people I spend a lot of time with are a lot older than you and me. So, well, they're my parents but yeah, that'd be great. So thanks so much for sharing all of your knowledge, for teaching me things in 2007 and in 2024 and in the future.
Oh, Sean, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. Okay. And thanks for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast, where you can find out all about getting NABCEP certified, and you can learn more from Tim Townsend. And Tim Townsend, hey, Tim, let us know, how should I explain what you do?
Solar engineering has been my thing. And so I am a professional mechanical engineer in California since like 1985.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks so much. And we're going to have in the show notes where to find Tim, his LinkedIn and things like that. Is there any other places where you want people to find you?
Well, I don't have a website or a company or anything like that. I still do spot consulting on the side, and I just do sort of my own basic research. So my email address is there on the LinkedIn thing as well.
Great. Maybe we could work together too.
Oh, I'd love to, Sean.
All right. Thanks for listening. See you, Tim.
Bye, guys.